g'day. How you going? What do you know? He'll strike a light. G'day. And how you going? Just say g'day, and you'll be right.
Welcome to the Midweek End Times News and Trends Briefing as we share major events and what is happening around the world as it relates to Bible prophecy. Today's date is April 27th, 2016. I want to start today with reading a devotion that I read from yesterday's In Touch Ministry by Charles Stanley, and it's just a great word of encouragement. It was entitled, Trained to Discern, and the passage that it starts out with was out of Hebrews chapter 5, verses 5 through 14, which says, In whom we have much to say and hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. And then verses 12 through 14 talks about the spiritual maturity. It says, For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God, and that you've come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. And it's not talking about good looks there. Verse 14, But solid food belongs to those who are full of age, that those who by reason use and have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. And so the devotional thought is, in today's world, impatience is all too common a trait. We want food, help, and information fast, just waiting for the computer to boot up or the next available agent to answer our call can be and cause frustration. But the Lord specializes in slow, steady work. He's more interested in a quality outcome than a speedy process. Nowhere is this more evident than in the realm of spiritual discernment. When we become Christians, we aren't instantly wise and knowledgeable. It takes a lifetime to grow into maturity. Some believers, however, don't seem to grow up at all. They get older, but their understanding of God's Word never goes very deep. This lack of godly wisdom is caused by ignorance of the Scriptures, apathy and complacency about spiritual things, and a failure to apply biblical truths. Discernment requires time and effort. You can't simply move through life, thoughtlessly reacting to situations yet never learning from them, taking time to reflect on your responses and observation, the consequences of your actions and choices. If you feel convicted by what you notice, let that motivate you to begin a lifelong pursuit of the Lord and His ways. Start reading the Bible regularly. And as you do, ask the Lord to open your heart and mind to understand what He is saying. But just reading God's Word isn't enough. Without applying what you've read, all you've gained is head knowledge. Obedience trains us to discern good and evil. And through practice, we can learn wisdom and develop spiritual maturity. If you begin today and patiently persevere, in time, discernment will come. What a great word of encouragement for us today. Now, on to today's End Times News Briefing. Just the other day, this report came out at the WND website, which is entitled EMP Alert. 2 North Korean satellites now orbit over U.S. The report talks about how North Korea now has 2 satellites orbiting over the U.S. capable of performing a surprise EMP attack at an altitude and trajectory that would invade U.S. national missile defenses, said a national security expert that warned in an interview on Joseph Farrar's G2 Bulletin. Peter Vince Pry told the G2 Bulletin that the satellites can be commanded either to deorbit and hit a target on the ground or explode at a high altitude to create an EMP effect that would knock out the unprotected U.S. national electric grid system and all life-sustaining critical infrastructures that depend upon it. Pry mentions that the threat continues to race like a hare-like at an alarming rate compared to a tortoise pace of the response or in the preparations. The satellites KMS-3-2 and KMS-4 are orbiting at an altitude of 300 miles with trajectories that would put them daily over the U.S. KMS-3-2 was launched in December 2012, and KMS-4 was launched in February 7th this last year. At such an altitude, the EMP could impact much of the continental U.S., according to EMP experts. North Korea, meanwhile, is preparing for its fourth underground nuclear detonation. Price said that it's really a hydrogen bomb with a purposeful for low-yielded design to emit more gamma rays for an EMP effect rather than for physical destruction on the ground. Pry also spoke to the G2 Bulletin after his recent testimonial to Canadian Security and Defense Committee on the biggest existential threat our civilization faces right now, an EMP attack. He said that, however, the fix is relatively simple and inexpensive. Russia and China, along with North Korea, already possess the ability to launch an EMP attack that could shut down indefinitely, such as life-sustaining critical infrastructures as communications, transportation, finance, water and food delivery, sanitation, medical equipment, emergency services, oil and natural gas pipelines. We've mentioned the threat of this attack in previous updates, but every week it's getting more real and potentially it could happen at any moment. So it's just a matter of time before this could be launched and upon any country for that matter. On to another threat. This one was on Monday. That was out of the Newsmax website, and it talks about how the Director of National Intelligence, Clapper, and he talks about how ISIS, Al-Qaida could strike before U.S. elections. So the terror group like ISIS or Al-Qaida could launch strikes within the U.S. To affect the presidential election this November. The Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, told Newsmax on Monday morning. Clapper, the top official of the U.S. intelligence community, would not say whether the terrorist group preferred or opposed any particular candidate. But in an obvious reference to the Republican frontrunner Donald Trump, he said that he was struck by how simple things are on the campaign trail and how those same issues are very hard in the confines of the White House in the Situation Room. At Washington, D.C., a press breakfast hosted by Christian Science Monitor, Newsmax asked Clapper if he felt ISIS or Al-Qaida was targeting the U.S. before the election with the possibility of influencing the outcome. Whether or not they might do something that might have bearing on the election, well, they could, particularly if they do something in this country, he replied. It would probably have some impact. It's kind of unknown, but it certainly influenced how people vote in this election. As to whether the terrorist group might prefer Trump to help rally jihadists, Clapper said, I cannot point to any evidence that would indicate a preference on this part of the ISIS as who is elected as our presidential election. Clapper goes on to say that he was concerned about how some of the rhetoric in this year's presidential campaign, however, he says, certainly you worry about the rhetoric on the campaign trail. I think that history has been that once a president is inaugurated and is in office, he realizes the burden and the responsibilities of the position. I think it's has a tempering effect on anyone. I think it's where here, regardless of who's elected. And of course, depends on who does get elected, will all depend on how they're going to handle and deal with these sort of threats, and if something were to happen, what they're going to do about it. On to a separate issue. This one takes place in Europe, in the country of Hungary. And this report came out of the Yahoo website and also Associated Press, and how the Hungarian Prime Minister, and he talks about how Islamization is banned by our Constitution. So this report that talks about Hungary's constitution bans Islamization because the document aims to protect Hungarians' language and culture, the Prime Minister said on Monday. He also said and talked about the Constitution forces the government to oppose any kind of mass migration that would endanger those principles. He goes on to say it would be very clear and unequivocal. I can say that the Islamization of this is constitutionally banned in Hungary. Part of their constitution, and he quotes this, that it's promoting and safeguarding the heritage, our unique language, Hungarian culture, and protection of the living conditions of future generations. Hungary maintains the migrant issue as a matter of national sovereignty. The Prime Minister goes on to say and says, we have the right to choose whom we want and don't want to live with. So again, Hungary has built these razor wire fences on the southern borders to stop migrants from passing through the other European nations. He wants zero migrants in the East European nation. And before the fences, there were nearly 400,000 migrants that entered Europe in 2015 on their way to other rich nations in Western Europe. Hungary had sued the UN at the European Court of Justice to avoid having to take part of a EU plan to resettle migrants. And the government also organizing a national referendum over the EU's quotas, meant to rally political support for the anti-immigrant position. So good for Hungary for putting up some boundaries to stop this crisis to infiltrate their country. Every country does have the right to decide who they want into the country and who they don't want into the country. It is part of their constitutional right. So good for Hungary for sticking up to its core values and the Constitution. On to another country in Europe, in Greece. This report came out of the Express on Tuesday, and how there's a ticking time bomb going off in Greece. It is Greece is set out to run out of cash by May, pushing Europe into another crisis. So the debt-ridden Greece is dangerously closing to running out of cash and plunging into the Eurozone into a fresh crisis. Athens desperately needs close to $6 billion worth of aid from creditors, but is refusing to make any further cutbacks to government spending. The payment is part of the third bailout agreed for Greece in the last summer, as the country reached the brink of bankruptcy and almost crashed out of the bloc. Now, left-wing government is resisting pressure by creditors to make unpopular economic reforms, including changes to taxes and pensions that were agreed on under the deal. The country could now run out of money by the end of or middle of May, according to a Greek report. Without money, Greece won't be able to make critical or crucial debt repayments to the European Central Bank, ECB, and the International Monetary Fund in June and July. The Prime Minister also argued for one of the Greece's huge debt had to be written off in order to allow the economy room to recover. Again, because things were not properly put in place, again, we do see this is going to begin a crisis around the world where a lot of countries are going down the same path economically. It's just a matter of time before we start to see the real devastation across the world. Venezuela, for example, is going through its own crisis and is run out of cash. And again, part of the socialistic and communistic mentality created a lot of this position for them. But you have countries like Greece that are going bankrupt and that are needing desperate reform and help economically. Onto a separate issue, and just this last week, again, Obama was traveling throughout the Middle East and on to Europe and also within Germany. And this report came out of the Times of Israel on Monday. And in a speech, Obama talks about that we're living in the most peaceful era in human history. So he is speaking to a bunch of European leaders in Germany, and he's talking about, and he says that people are healthier, wealthier, and more educated than ever before. and I would have to agree on that. But I wouldn't say that it's the most peaceful time in history. We're seeing more wars and rumors of wars and fights and wars going on than any other time in history. And he goes on to say that the people of the world are living in the most peaceful and prosperous era in human history, he said on Monday in a landmark speech in Germany. And he goes on to say that I want to begin with an observation. Given the challenges that we face in the world and the headlines that we see every day may seem improbable, but it's true. We are fortunate to be living in the most peaceful, most prosperous, most progressive era in human history. I would have to say progressive would be true as well, because if you see the liberalism and accepting and just the whole relativism mentality goes on. If you had to choose, he goes on to say in the speech, any moment in time to be born, any time in human history, you didn't know ahead of time what the nationality you were, or gender, or economic status might be, you choose today. He goes on to talk about and increasing the democracies around the world and improving global health and educational standards. And he cautioned, however, that it isn't easy to say that there's not an enormous suffering or enormous tragedy and so much work for us to do. Some of that work, presumptuously, surrounds the effort to the end of the bloody civil war in Syria, which has taken more than 250,000 lives in the past 5 years. Obama said that he would ask the heads of Germany, Britain, France, and Italy to step up their training and airstrike contributions to the campaign against the Islamic State group, and to provide more economic aid to rebuild parts of Iraq recaptured from ISIS. Europe and NATO can still do more, he says. We need to do everything in our power to stop them. Europe has sometimes been complacent about its own defense, Obama said, repeating its longstanding for NATO to the allies to increase defense spending at least 2% of the economic output. The president also made an impasse plea for European unity in the face of populism, skepticism, warning that this defining moment in the continent. A strong and united Europe is necessary for the world, Obama said shortly before meeting other world leaders. In reading this and hearing this, and you hear this talk from a lot of politicians, but it reminds me of the passage out of 1 Thessalonians 5, where there is this talk of peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes. And as you go through politician to politician, country to country, there is this talk of peace and safety. And that is what they want you to believe. But there's anything but peace and safety in this world. The only peace and safety that we really have is in Jesus Christ. Onto a separate issue, and there's not a day that goes by where this sort of issue isn't brought to the headlines. But this one came out the previous week out of the lifesitenews.com. And the headline is, UK city asks parents to let 4-year-olds pick their own gender. So the parents in Britain are outraged after their city council sent them letters asking them to support their gender identity of their children, some of whom are as young as 4. The letter, which was sent this week or past week, and was praised by the UK LGBT organization Stonewall, sent thousands of parents whose children are preparing to enter new schools. It reads this in the letter. It says, "We recognize that not all children and young people identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth or may identify as gender other than male or female. However, the current system, set nationally, only record gender as male or female. Please support your children to choose the gender that they most identify with. Or, if they have another gender identity, please leave this blank and discuss with your child's school." And, of course, there is this within the survey. There's about 25 options to choose from to include boy and girl, but also queer gender, trigender, gender fluid, and things like that, for example. And when you read this sort of stuff, it just does your head in. This transgender stuff is just getting way out of control, and it's just getting way too far out there. And it's just for a handful of people. There might be just 100 people, or up to maybe 1,000 plus, a couple thousand, if that. In a country the size of the UK, which has 64 million people. Same thing within the US, you got 319 million people, or here in Australia, you got about 23 million people. But you don't need to change the laws of the land or department stores because you got just a handful of people that are really confused. And there's such a battle for the hearts and the minds of the people today, and especially the kids these days. And it doesn't seem like a day goes by without any of these issues are coming to the front pages of the press and of the media and of Facebook, to the news reports. And while not downplaying the controversy, the issue goes much deeper than it really appears on the surface. Many people are not looking at all the ramifications of endorsing this right to choose and the untold damage of this philosophy that will have on the next generation. One of the more recent developments or that has happened medically is the use of these kind of what they call puberty blockers to treat children who believe that they are transgender. And these kind of medications suppresses the body's production of estrogen or testosterone, especially, and it's essentially to pause the changes that would occur to them during puberty. And this is going to cause a lot of unrepairable damage to them, not only physically, but also mentally and emotionally and psychologically, as these sort of blockers prevent the hormone-induced biological changes. Even the vocal cords, the different structures of the body, as well, the changes that are irreversible. And the parents that are now finding that their young children on the battle lines as the LGBT proponents force the diversity philosophies upon the next generation. This whole idea of what is called moral relativism is this new law of the land, and society rejects that gift of gender that God has given us. You're born male or female. You cannot change that fact. And your chromosomes and the DNA prove who you are. We live in an age rushing headlong into darkness while professing to be enlightened. And the words of the Bible ring so true in our society, even more today than it did then, but it affects every society, who exchange the truth of God for a lie. And sadly, many Christians are believing the lie. There's been too much compromise in people's lives, and this is the error, the direction of going in that path. And so the truth needs to be spoken, and we need to do it in love. We need to do it with boldness and be courageous about it. And then finally, this one was a report. It shows you the condition of society. It shows you the hopelessness of so many people, more today than ever before. It was a report that came out of the CBN website, and it talks about how the U.S. suicide rate is the highest in 30 years. So a federal report reveals that the suicide rate in the United States is higher than it's ever been in 30 years. The National Center for Health Statistics reports that the overall suicide rate has increased 24% between 1999 and 2014. That means that the nation's suicide rate has jumped to 13 per 100,000 people. According to the New York Times, an increase is very steep for women and young girls between 10 and 14. The number of young girls who committed suicide rose from 150 in 2014, which was a huge jump from 50 girls in 1999. The rate also is the highest seen in increase in men and middle-aged Americans than ever before. It's really stunning to see such a large increase in suicide rates affecting virtually every age group, said Catherine Hempstead, the senior advisor for health care at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So the rise in suicide has not only affected the age and gender, but also the racial and ethnic groups. American Indians have seen the sharpest rise in suicide out of all ethnic groups. Suicide among Native women has risen by 89% and 38% for men. The issue of suicide is such an important subject to talk about. I'm sure every single one of us that's listening has been affected by this. And there's a lot of people that would have and buy into the myth that, oh, don't talk about suicide with the person who's deeply depressed because it might give them ideas. And that is one of the many myths that are out there concerning this subject. Because you can assume that even most depressed people or very anxious people have given some thought to taking their lives. I don't think there's not a person that's been around that hasn't had that idea. For a person considering suicide, having someone to talk to can be a very powerful preventative, and having someone that can care and to minister to you. And of course, the scriptures is one of the most important things that we can rely on. I know personally for me, one of the most important scriptures that's helped me in difficult times, and it's helped many people as well all throughout time, is Romans 8:28, where all things work together for the good, so no matter what you're going through, but also in the first part of that chapter of Romans 8, where it says, there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And that's what the enemy wants to do. He wants to bring condemnation. He wants to bring fear and worry and hopelessness. Suicide is the desperate attempt to get out of what seems to be kind of an intolerable situation. It becomes a way of escape from living in pain, whether it's emotional or physical or mental or whatever. There's excessive loss that's happening in a person's life, a loss of a spouse, employment, finances, loss of romance, or loss of reputation. They're feeling unloved and maybe abandoned. Maybe there's critical illness that's going on, chronic pain to terminal ill disease, chronic depression. Maybe they've come from an abusive background where there's this mental, emotional abuse that's happened to them, physical abuse, sexual abuse. Maybe there's a satanic involvement in this. Maybe there's a psychological disorder, clinical depression to maybe a chemical imbalance. Maybe there's an unbalanced desire for revenge to get at someone or wanting attention. There's perhaps even excessive guilt that a person might be going through, and they can't bear the pain or the feeling of shame anymore. And maybe you know someone who is going through such a difficult time that some of these characteristics that we've just mentioned. Please, I encourage you to cast your care upon the Lord because He cares for you. Please talk to someone whom you can trust and who will love you and walk with you through this difficult time and period that you're going through. And we, as believers, need to be praying for wisdom, for comfort, for peace, for healing, for those who are experiencing these difficulties, and for the family and those who have lost someone who has committed suicide. They need to experience the love and grace of the Lord. And one of the most essential lifelines that you can provide to someone that might be suicidal is hope. You might feel fearful or inadequate or to become involved in someone that you think is suicidal. But here's the thing. God may draw you into their life to be a reflection of His love and of His guidance and of His grace. And do consider some of these divine encounters to be a kind of a candle of hope with someone living in darkness. And may we all be instruments of grace and truth, of hope and healing and salt and light as we come in contact with all the people that God puts in our path. Amen? And that concludes today's update.